Power between Saul and David. We've seen how God takes away his spirit from Saul, but then he anoints David. Samuel anoints David, and the Holy Spirit falls upon David. The interesting thing is David goes back to being a shepherd. But today we're going to read about the story of David and Goliath, and it's a story most people are familiar with. I think about the Goliaths in my life that I've conquered and I face daily. Believe it or not, I don't like public speaking. I don't like being in front of a camera. I prefer to sit in the back somewhere, right? When I talk, if you listen carefully to certain consonants, I actually stutter. It's a genetic thing that I have, right? That's a Goliath I've had to conquer. Another Goliath I had is my time, right? I work 50, 60 hours a week. On top of that, Bible study is like 15 and 20 hours a week, right? Just keeping sanity and keeping my normal schedule, right? That's a challenge. That's a huge Goliath. Work is often difficult. Never feel work is easy, right? That takes a lot of work. I always feel like I could be praying more, doing more evangelism. These are all voices in my head that are Goliaths, right? That I face daily. And in our lives and in your life, there's a new Goliath every single day, right? There's a new Goliath that you and I face all the time. And in verse 1, as we start reading this, now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. This is in Israel. They encamped between Soko and Ezekah in Ephes Dammim. Now the Israelites have been constant enemies of the Philistines. This is an ongoing battle with them. This particular battle is monumental because these two armies are going to oppose each other on a mountain. And Saul and the men of Israel, verse 2, were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them. So both armies are on a mountain, right? There's a valley between them. Try to imagine this in your head, right? Two large armies. The idea is, in order to fight the other army, you had to go up the mountain. So they're strategically placed, alongside these mountains, or on these mountains. Now, verses 4 to 11, we're going to see a description of Goliath. It's one of the most descriptive descriptions of a warrior in the Bible. In verse 4, and a champion, that word champion means one who stands in the middle, he went down from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, 1 cubit is approximately 1.5 feet. 6 cubits was approximately 9 feet 6 inches, plus or minus a few inches. If you know basketball, you can think of like really tall people. Think of like Manupo. For the Sixers had a guy named Sean Bradley or Yao Ming. Right? I think they were like 7'5" or 8 foot, pretty close. So Goliath is about 9 feet tall, and we read about this town called Gath. In Joshua 11:22, we read that the Anakim, which is a race of giants, they were actually left in Gath. Right? Joshua didn't destroy this city. We also know that the nation of Israel had fought giants already. For example, when the spies are sent into the land, the people come back with a report and they say, there are giants in the land and we felt like grasshoppers in their sight. We read in scripture about Og and Bashan, right? Actually, after the Red Sea, the kings of Og and Bashan are the most mentioned incident in the Exodus, right? And we read that these were giants. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, we'll read that the king of Og, right, he had a 9-cubit bed. He was a giant. That's like 13 or 14 feet. If you just Google like giants in North America or giants in Asia, you'll see pictures from the past of these skeletal remains of giants. I'm not making this up. You can go Google it and find out. But there were races of giants that lived right before we lived. Goliath comes from one of these tribes of giants. In verse 5, he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And this kind of looked like scales on a fish, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Now, this is between like 150 and 175 pounds. So, hey guys, so think about like how heavy this is on your body. And he had a bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. Now that's a 25-pound spear, and his shield bearer went before him. So think about this massive guy. His armor is 200 pounds. That's almost like my weight. And he's holding a 25-pound spear. And this guy is massive, right? He's 9'6", wearing 200 pounds, 25-pound spear. And he stood in verse 8. Then he stood, and he cried out to the armies of Israel. Notice he's crying out. He's taunting them. And he said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me." Now remember, the armies are on the mountain. Goliath actually is brave enough to come down to the valley and taunt Israel as they're on the mountain. He says, "Come down to me." In verse 9, he says, "If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." So Goliath, he's taunting Israel, right? He's basically mocking them. And he gives them the wager. He says, if you guys win, we'll be your servants. If we win, then you be our servants. Now the irony is, when Israel actually wins, they start to run. They don't become their servants, right? They don't keep this end of the bargain here. But a greater question to ask is this, right? You know, if God is with us, right, why does he allow these Goliaths in our life, right? Oftentimes, God allows giant problems in our life so that we would learn to depend on him. We would learn to trust him. Now, I think about when I first moved to Florida, I was working full time. I was going to Bible college at night. I was exhausted, right? Being a teacher is hard enough, but on top of that, taking class was hard. Just figuring out how to get my day together was hard. But I remember thinking God, how am I going to do this? And there were those days, and you guys had this experience, where God gives you more energy, or my classes will get mysteriously canceled, or the bad kid in my class would be out, right? Those little things, right? God is using to fight the Goliaths in my life. But in our life, right? He'll always send a Goliath. He'll always send something larger than we can handle so that you and I will learn to depend on him. For me, I started out sharing this. For me, often it's just the number of hours in my week. Most of my Bible studies prepared between before 7 a.m. or after 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., right? My Goliath is, how in the world am I going to get up, work at a very difficult job, right? A lot of problem solving, do a Bible study. That's my Goliath week in and week out, right? Not to mention everything else. I also have a family, right? I also have kids. I have a wife, right? But on top of that, I ask, God, why do you allow these Goliaths in our life? And oftentimes it's because he wants us to learn to depend on him. In verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Notice this. Goliath's purpose in taunting Israel was to make them afraid, and that actually happens. He succeeds in taunting Israel, and he's successful in doing that. The enemy's strategy is always to discourage us. It's always to dishearten us. And it's always to paralyze us with fear. Because I think about how Satan works. He always wants us to be paralyzed with fear. And oftentimes, the Goliath in our life is some sinful stronghold, that God uses. And Satan uses to mock us and to accuse us. Oftentimes, I hear Satan saying, and you hear this too, it's in your genes. You'll never get over it. You're a hypocrite. You're a backslider. It's the constant voices, the constant accusations that Satan gives us. For me, it was public speaking, right? You're not worthy enough. You're not good enough. I hate being on camera. I wish I could turn the camera off. I wish I could sit down in the back somewhere. But it's always the constant accusation. You don't pray enough. You're not ready. You're not doing this enough. Think about this here. The logical choice, now everyone's afraid in the army. The logical choice to fight the giant of the Philistines was the giant of Israel. Saul was the giant of Israel. Remember, he was head and shoulders above every man. But the Spirit of the Lord had departed from him, and he had lost all his courage. In verse 12, Now David was a son of the Ephraimite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. So this is a big family. We met David's 3 older brothers in the previous chapters. We see them here again during the battle. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. You know what's interesting here? David has been anointed as king, but he's still going back and forth to feed his father's sheep. You know, God didn't use the palace to prepare David. That's really interesting to me. He was using the grazing fields of the sheep. He was using, the pasture. He was using everything out there to prepare David and prepare his heart. Later on, he's going to talk about the lion and the bear coming to attack him. That was the place that God was using to prepare David. In verse 16, and the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Think about this. He's continually taunting them. If you ever had a bully like in elementary school, it's like you hate to go to school because they're always teasing you, always making fun of you, always taunting you. Maybe you were the bully, right? You were always doing the teasing. But we always have the voices in our head that taunt us day in and day out, right? Goliath is taunting Israel. What voice do you have in your head, right? Taunting you for 40 days and 40 nights, saying, you're not good enough. You're not worthy enough, right? You have sin in your life. You're not forgiven. You're not perfect, right? It's always taunting us. And Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. This is a good dad that cares about his sons. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. So this is a smart dad. Not only is he trying to give food to his kids, he says, let's give food to the captain so that my kids will be in good favor with him. And David is assigned a job here. He becomes Uber Eats for a day. All right, he's literally just a delivery guy. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. This is likely shouting or arguing here. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. So David here, he's just doing his job. But think about this. How did David know where his brothers were? Right? It's a huge army, right? So remember, David's from the family of Judah. The family of Judah the tribe of Judah would always travel in the front of Israel. David knew to go to the front of the army here. And then you talk with them. Then as you talk with them, there was a champion, the Philistine of Gath, verse 23, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the men, fled from him, and they were dreadfully afraid. Notice that phrase, dreadfully afraid. It's almost like they're paralyzed in their steps. And I think of Proverbs 29:25. The Bible says this, the fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe. So the men of Israel said in verse 25, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So Saul knows that he needs to stop Goliath, and now he's throwing money into the pot. He's giving them a reward, and the reward is going to be 3 parts here. Number 1, riches. Number 2, his daughter's hand in marriage. Number 3, no taxes for his family. And the funny thing about this is that later in 1 Samuel 18, David is going to say, Saul's going to say, he wants to give his daughter to David as a snare to him to mess him up. So apparently he knows that his daughter is not good to begin with, so he's trying to give her away pretty early here. In verse 26, then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man? Now David's speaking here. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see, that David saw the problem from God's perspective. There was only one giant, and the giant wasn't Goliath. The only giant was God. Because notice what he says here. For who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? For you and I, it would benefit us to see every problem from God's perspective. When you get a flat tire, right, it's so easy to be frustrated and think, oh, more money out of my pocket, I got to take it to the repair shop and fix my flat tire. But what if God wants you to go to the repair shop, right, and maybe invite that person to church, or share Christ with them, or pray for that person? Right? There's no coincidence in a flat tire. At work, when I get stuck on a problem and it's been hours, I get frustrated because I'm like, God, I prayed to you, I wanted an answer, you didn't give it to me. But then I see this from God's perspective. What if he wants me to talk to someone, right? And maybe share my faith with them, and talk to them about Christ, or maybe just share with them what's going on in my life. Right? It becomes an opportunity to do that. I think about sickness. You can see sickness as something that's frustrating, or you can see sickness as an opportunity to maybe just slow down. And maybe God is asking us to, pause and focus on him. And it's the same way with like finances or bills or anything that happens. In verse 27, and the people answered him in the manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, verse 28, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? So his brothers are really giving it to him here. He says, I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Eliab is the oldest brother. As the oldest brother, maybe he's been changing David's diapers. He's been feeding him applesauce when he was a baby. He's been playing with him. His brother rips into him here. He says, no, who have you left the sheep with here in the wilderness? No, he's angry. He starts throwing accusations at them. He starts accusing David of abandoning the sheep, of being disrespectful. But think about this. There's something deeper going on here, because they're so offended by David. Here's what I've noticed in my life, and maybe you see this in your life. Whenever there's a bold expression of faith, it exposes the fear and the insecurity of other people around us. And it's often expressed as anger. Because think about this. All the soldiers are around and they're hearing taunts for 40 days. Right? Every day they got to hear this guy making fun of Israel and try cursing them out and calling them like weaklings. 40 days or 40 nights they're hearing this taunting. Now David steps in and suddenly he just steps up to the battle. Everyone else, I'm sure, is a little, they feel like a wimp because now David's stepping up. Here's how it works practically. If you suddenly say you're going on a mission trip and someone else has been there praying about this for 20 years, suddenly they feel convicted. And in their heart they feel, why haven't I done this? Right? And suddenly they feel, who's this guy saying they're going on a mission trip? Right? Doesn't he know how much it costs? Doesn't he know how much faith you need? Blah, blah, blah. All of that insecurity suddenly starts to bubble out. That happens when you switch jobs. Right? Everyone else is comfortable in their job. You switch jobs because you have faith. Everyone else is like, oh, don't you know it's going to be a longer commute and a new boss or whatever. The idea is it exposes the insecurity of other people. It happens when you move. It happens when you start a new hobby. Bold faith exposes the insecurity of people around us. And notice this too. Whenever we step out in faith to do great things for God, the opposition will always come from those closest to us. Because notice his brothers here, they're ripping into him, right? They're accusing him. Charles Spurgeon, he had this really great quote. He said this, many a man meets with more trouble from his friends than from his enemies. And when he has learned to overcome the depressing influence of prudent friends, he makes short work of the opposition of avowed adversaries. Now, that's a great quote. David could have easily quit. He could have gone home. He could have said, I'm done. What's the purpose of me being here? My brothers don't want me here. But he doesn't. And in verse 29, and David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. David here feels misunderstood. He says, what have I done? What am I doing wrong? All I did was volunteer to fight. Like in reality, what did he do wrong? Right? He was just delivering food. He just volunteered to fight. Part of this is typical fighting between brothers. Part of this is typical family stuff. As a believer in Jesus, you will often be misunderstood for your arrogance and your pride. You know, when I refuse to go to a family event because there's alcohol, and if you're part of my family and you're listening on camera, I don't go to your event because there is alcohol. But if everyone's drunk, like what conversation can you have meaningfully? But people look on and say, oh, you're arrogant, you're prideful. Right? And this happens with any type of event. As a believer in Christ, your faith will often be misunderstood. Right? People will never understand why you're doing the things you do. I mean, it's a story of my life. I can give you 100 examples. I'm sure you guys can give me 100 examples. But verse 31, now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Remember, David's a little kid. He's like 15 years old. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. David says to everyone, guys, calm down. Remember, everyone's dreadfully afraid. The men are panicking here. He says, I'll go and fight. 40 days and 40 nights they've been taunted. David says, I'll volunteer. You see, true faith, it empowers us to be proactive, and it empowers us to fight for God's kingdom. There's a sense of empowerment, there's a sense of energy, right, that comes when there's faith in our life. There's a sense of saying, you know, I don't want to be passive about this anymore. I want to be proactive, and I want to share Christ with people. You know, what's interesting, when we started the Bible study back in Broomall, we were giving out cards to people, right, just business cards, and I never thought it would work, but we were just giving out cards in stores. I walked into stores, I found people that were sitting there bored looking at their phones. Hey, here's a business card, come to our Bible study. Believe it or not, that's how we met Joseph. You guys remember Joseph and Robin? He came for the next 5 years, I'm still in touch with him, but just from handing out a business card, right, for a Bible study at a Radio Shack, right, we met a friend, become a friend for 7 years. But you never know what a step of faith will do. You never know what a step of faith will do in another person's life. And Saul said to David, verse 33, you are not able to go against the Philistines to fight with you, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Saul looks at David's age. Saul looks at David's inexperience. He says, you're a kid. This guy has been, fighting longer than you've been ever born. Right? I think about like some of the older basketball players now, right? Like LeBron James or the other, like Carmelo Anthony. And a lot of the players that play with him now, they were like babies when he was like growing up, right? I mean, it happens in every sport. But it's the same thing happening here. Everyone's looking at David and saying, this guy's been fighting longer than you've been born. And when we step out of faith, the second voice of criticism will often come from experts who rule out the power of God. Now, I'll give you an example here. You guys know who Tim Tebow is? But think about this story, and I'll just read this quick excerpt. In 1985, the Tebows moved to the Philippines with their 4 children to serve as missionaries. Pam Tebow, his mom, became ill with amoebic dysentery, which is usually transmitted from contaminated drinking water. She fell into a temporary coma and received strong drugs to combat the infection. These drugs resulted in severe placental abruption, in which the placenta detaches from the uterine wall. That condition can deprive the fetus of oxygen and other necessary elements. When it was discovered she was pregnant, doctors stopped the drugs, but she said that high doses of medicine had already damaged the fetus. The account is part of Tim Tebow's recent bestseller, Through My Eyes. Because they believed the baby would not survive, doctors recommended an abortion so that Pam Tebow's life would not be risked. They thought I should have an abortion to save my life from the beginning all the way through the 7th month. She refused the abortion because of her faith. She prayed that she and her husband would have a healthy son. I never knew the whole backstory to that. I never knew about how sick his mom was, but think about what he's gone on to achieve, right? Played in the NFL, won numerous Heisman trophies, won the college football championship numerous times, right? Still very popular, right? Everywhere. When Jesus calls Peter out to walk in the water, Peter's a fisherman. He knows the water well. He doesn't talk about the laws of gravity. He doesn't talk about, the boat sinking. He's been swimming in the water forever. He just gets out and walks. That doesn't mean we abandon all wisdom. That doesn't mean we abandon knowledge from godly people. But oftentimes, expert advice is not good advice. In verse 34, but David said to Saul, now this is what David's replying back here. Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from his mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. You see, God had been preparing David by protecting sheep. He says, your servant has killed both lion and bear. Think about that, right? A lion charging at you. And somehow David grabs the lion and kills him. And think about a bear charging at you. Like David had killed this bear before. Here's what I've noticed. Oftentimes, God prepares us for greater things right where we are. Our job is not to worry about the future, but rather just to be faithful where we are. Whether you realize it or not, if you've been walking with God, He's already been preparing you. Now, I think about the stages of my life. Like when I moved to Florida for the first time, I had already been a teacher. Right? God knew I needed that job. He was already preparing me. When I worked at Calvin Fort Lauderdale, everything I had done as a teacher, right, I used those skills in that particular job. Right? I had to talk to kids, I had to talk to parents. God was preparing me for that. When I moved back here and I worked in real estate, God was preparing me. Right? All the people skills I have, the amount of time I spent talking to people. But if you look at your life, we see the same thing. Every stage of our lives, God's preparing us. He's teaching us. The skills that you had and He's been teaching you in the past, or He's preparing you for the next step. And notice David's confidence here in verse 37. He says, the Lord who delivered me. David's confidence wasn't in his strength. His confidence wasn't in his ability to kill a bear or a lion. He says it was God that delivered me. And that was his confidence. If you have a lot of stress, or maybe anxiety or worry, that should be your confidence. You should be able to look back at your life and say, God delivered me here, and God delivered me there, and God delivered me this time. And we can look back on our life and say, you know what, God? You've been faithful. Just as you delivered me then, I know you're going to deliver me tomorrow. In verse 38, so David, clothed with his armor, he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. Verse 39, David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Saul assumes that David needs the best armor. He assumes that David needs the best helmet. You and I do the same thing all the time. You can fight a battle you can't fight a battle the same way someone else fights a battle. David says, I can't walk with these. You and I, we often make the mistake of trying to fight battles the way we see other people doing them, when all we need to do is trust the Lord. This is hard because the way that someone else fights their battles, it may seem logical, it may seem obvious, it may seem natural, it may even seem godly. But it may not be the way God is calling us to fight our particular battle. If someone else starts a side business, maybe selling like fashionable handbags, and you think, wow, they're making a lot of money, that may not be what God's calling you to do. Maybe someone else is reading a lot of great books, or maybe they started college, or they started a master's program. Just because that's what God calls them to do doesn't mean that that's what God's calling us to do. That's what God's calling you to do. If someone else is going on a mission trip, that doesn't mean God's calling me to do that. If someone else is gossiping or taking revenge on someone else, right? As believers, God never calls us to do that. What's interesting for me, when I think about like teaching the Bible and doing evangelism, most people do this like full time, right? They have 40 hours a week to prepare a Bible study. I'm like scrambling at like before bedtime to keep my eyes open, like typing early in the morning or late at night. And there's always a voice. Wear someone else's armor. Just quit. Get a job at a church. Comfortable. 2 days a week off, right? Everyone, like, half the people don't listen to you during the week anyway, so there's no like real performance goals to meet. You just got to be nice. You can't punch anyone. You'll keep your job. I say this because I worked at a church, right? I know how the system goes. And don't get me wrong, it's hard. But it's not my armor. It's not the armor I'm called to put on. I've done that, and I've been miserable. But what's the armor God's calling you to put on that doesn't fit anyone else? David Guzik says this, I will not fight with man's armor. I will trust in the Lord and his armor instead. Verse 40, then he took a staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The most interesting part of the story? Think about where the brook was. This is 2 mountains, right? Water flows down a mountain. Most scholars believe the brook would be in the middle between the mountains. David has to walk from the mountain all the way down to the brook unarmed. Think about this. He has nothing in his hands. He's just walking without a sling. He's walking without stones. Many scholars make that point. Think about how bold and committed he is in his faith. In verse 41, so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went with him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. He was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now God's angry, right? Like this isn't going to go well. And the Philistine said to David, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and beasts of the field. Goliath looks at David, he mocks his appearance, he's like, who's this little kid coming at me? Right? In fact, he almost feels insulted that they sent David to come fight him. There was absolutely nothing that was making Goliath afraid now. He's completely emboldened, right? He feels offended. He says, am I a dog? In Hebrew, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 18, that's translated as a male homosexual prostitute. He's saying, what am I? Am I like a prostitute that you send me this good-looking kid to me? Like he's completely mocking David and all of Israel. Now, Goliath is going to come to David taunting, but David's going to come back to Goliath in the power of God. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you defied. Notice David's assurance. David's assurance was that he wasn't alone in battle. His assurance was the armies of the living God were with him. Think about what David must have been thinking about right now. Maybe he was thinking about Genesis 32, about the story of Jacob. After Jacob frees from Laban, it says the angels of God, they met him at Mahanaim. I bet Jacob was scared, thinking that Laban was going to turn around and kill him. And God sent his angels there to comfort him and to bring him peace. Maybe he was thinking about Israel's history. Maybe about all the plagues and how God had delivered them. Maybe he was thinking about the fight against the Amalekites. Maybe he was thinking about how Israel has fought against Og and Bashan, the giants. Maybe he was thinking about the destruction of Jericho. In his head, he had all of Israel's history to remind him of God's power. Maybe he was thinking about, Joshua chapter 5, about the commander of the Lord in the army, at Gilgal, and how he miraculously appeared to Joshua. Maybe he was thinking about, just a few chapters earlier in 1 Samuel 7, when Samuel's offering a sacrifice, and the Philistines come to attack him, but God thunders down, with his voice. All these stories, David had to think about and meditate on. In verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. And notice David's faith here. David's faith is getting bolder and bolder. And I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give you the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines, the birds of the air, and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Notice he gets bolder and bolder. Now they're standing between two mountains. This is all echoing in the valley. He says, I'll strike your head, I'm going to decapitate you, I'm going to throw your carcass back to the camp. There is absolutely no fear in David's life here. In verse 36, he had promised he would kill Goliath. Now he promises, I'll kill him today, right now. And not only will I kill him, I'm going to cut his head off. But think about, there was absolutely no fear in his mind here. But notice David's motive in verse 46. His motive wasn't personal fame. His motive here, it was a reputation of God's name. Because he says this, that all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. And that was his motive. His motive wasn't to show off how good his sling was. His motive was to show off how good and amazing God was. In verse 47, that all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David didn't just want the earth to know about God's power. He also wanted Israel to know. He wanted the assembly to know in verse 27. But notice David's humility. He says he will give you into our hands. He didn't say God. He didn't say we will. He said God will give you into our hands. In verse 48, we see the battle here. The battle is really 2 verses. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to David, David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Notice David doesn't he's not crawling, he's not walking slowly here, right? He's not hiding. He literally runs up to Goliath, full speed here. Everyone else is thinking, Goliath is so big, right? I can't beat him. David was thinking, Goliath is so big, I can't miss him. He literally runs toward Goliath, and David put his hand in his bag, and he took out a stone, and he slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face of the earth. What's really interesting about this battle, unlike the other battles of Israel, there's no miraculous intervention by God. There's no thunder, there's no earthquake, there's no lightning, there's no hailstones. There's nothing miraculous about this battle. David's using a sling and stones. Oftentimes in our life, God works supernaturally through very natural means. God simply worked through David's sling, and he simply worked through David's stones. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27 says this, for God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put shame the wise. God has chosen the mighty things of the world to put shame the things which are mighty. So oftentimes, many Christians also struggle with this fact. How much should I pray and how much should I actually work and do something? It's a battle many Christians have. David could have said, well, I'll let God fight this battle and shoot down thunder and send an earthquake. He could have said that. And oftentimes we say, you know what, I need to just stand back and pray and not do nothing. And many times we do. But oftentimes, that's not how God operates. We often need to fight our battles, and you've heard this before, by praying like it all depends on God, but by working like it all depends on us. David here gets into battle, he fights, he puts himself out there, and he lets it loose. And notice Goliath, he falls on his face. Back in 1 Samuel 5 verse 2, Dagon, the statue, had fallen on his face, exact same way. First, Dagon, the god, falls on his face. Now the worshiper of Dagon falls on his face. Notice the symmetry here, the symbolism. So verse 50, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took a sword. Notice he takes Goliath's sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Notice that Goliath there, he's killed by his own sword here. For you and I ask myself every day, what is the battle that I'm called to fight? What is the battle that you and I are called to fight? You know, Ephesians 6:12 says this, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. All of us have a battle to fight. You know, what is that battle? You know, I mentioned this before. For me, the battle week after week is, you know, how do I teach the Bible? How do I share Christ with people? How do I love my wife, love my family? How do I do a decent job at work? Right? There's a battle that all of us are called to fight each and every day, right? That he calls us to step into. And notice here that the Philistines fled at the end of verse 51. Their agreement was to be the servants of Israel. They didn't keep their side of the agreement, right? As soon as Goliath falls, they run. And verse 52, now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. Suddenly the men of Israel, they're empowered to fight. Suddenly they're getting up and they're chasing the Philistines down. Think about what David did. Never underestimate how contagious your faith is. Never underestimate how contagious one person's faith is to set a family on fire, or your friends on fire, or anyone around you looking toward Jesus. Because all it does, it takes one person who's willing to speak up, one person willing to step out. You know, I think about Pride Month, right? I love gay people, right? I love people that are LGBTQ. I have friends that are that way. I don't believe in it. I don't support it at all, right? But think about this. It only takes one person in a workplace, one person in a family to blow it up and do a big deal, right? It just takes one person. It takes one person on fire for Jesus to blow it up, right? To blow his name up the right way. And David took the head of the Philistine in verse 54 and brought it to Jerusalem and put his armor in his tent. Think about David's tent here. If you ever seen someone with like a hunting wall, they have like elk and geese. I don't know if there's geese, but there's like deer and buffalo, and they have the horns. David has like a bear now. He's got a lion. Now he's got Goliath's sword. Right? You're going to read soon. He literally decapitates Goliath's head. He's walking around with Goliath's head. Like you'll read about it in a second here. But what's interesting about the sword, in 1 Samuel 21, verse 9, when David is fleeing from Saul later, Ahimelech, the priest, actually offers David Goliath's sword, right, as a weapon to fight Saul, which is interesting. In verse 55, when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? You know, when I read this, I wanted to punch Saul. David has literally been in his court. Like, he forgot who David was, right? As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Saul doesn't recognize David even after he's been in his own court. Remember, he had the distressing spirit upon him, right? Obviously, he's confused his thinking. And verse 56, so the king said, inquire whose son this young man is, Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. He's still holding the head of Goliath in his hand. Like, imagine this scene, like blood coming down. He's literally walking down with his head. You know, every time I run a race, I wear my medal around my house, or I'll let my kids hold it. Like, I did something great. No one really cares at the end of the day, right? But David's walking around with David's head. And Saul said to him in verse 58, "Whose son are you, young man?" So David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." We'll end there. These are my final thoughts. And I apologize, I'm speaking fast. This chapter is 58 verses, so I had to speed read. But a couple final thoughts that I thought really spoke to me. Every Goliath in my life, I've realized, is absolutely necessary. Goliaths in our life are absolutely necessary for spiritual growth. And the reason why God puts it there is because He loves us. You know, if there wasn't a Goliath in my life, I'd be lazy. I'd be, just doing things I shouldn't be doing. But every Goliath in my life, it keeps me praying. It keeps me humble. Every Goliath in my life teaches me greater about God's power, about God's love, about His mercy. In fact, here's what I've realized. God has been preparing you and me for every Goliath that you're facing. You may not realize it tomorrow. You may not realize it next week. But He's been preparing you and teaching you how to face every Goliath. Every Goliath is an opportunity for us to grow in God's power and God's love. Now, don't get me wrong here. My Goliaths in my life cause me anxiety. They do cause me stress. They do cause me fear. Right? Every Goliath in my life often requires me to change my routines, requires me to change my habits, requires me to change my schedule. But here's what I realize. As I wholeheartedly seek Christ in the midst of every Goliath, I see the fruit of His peace growing in my heart. This year, I can handle more stress than I did last year. Last year, I could handle more stress than I did the year before. Now, that doesn't always work in a linear way. We all have bad years. We all have bad decades. But as we walk with Christ, the fruit of peace, it grows in our life. Another point from this chapter I thought was interesting. Expressions of faith are often met with misunderstanding. They trigger the insecurity of people around us. People lash out at us. People mock us. We can expect that to happen. And finally, last but not least, David's victory over Goliath is symbolic of something greater. And it's symbolic of Jesus' victory over sin and death. Both represented God's people. Both fought an enemy that was able to dominate God's people. Both were sent to the battlegrounds by their father. Both were ridiculed by their brethren. Both used methods that didn't make sense to the world. David is slinging stones, Jesus his blood on the cross. Both fought a victory that was assured before the battle even began. I would encourage you, as you look at the Goliath in your life, continue to grow to see Christ. If you don't know Christ, if you don't know people, if there are people in your life that don't know Christ, be bold with your faith. Be bold with what you share. Share the love of Christ with them. You never know how contagious one person's faith will grow.